All right. So, what I want to talk about today is this idea that writing on the internet can teach you entrepreneurship, can teach you how to be this minimalist entrepreneur that you talk about in your book. And let's start off with what writing online can teach you about marketing. One of the tactics that you teach in the Minimalist Entrepreneur is to focus on a small group when you start. Specifically, the example that I liked that's coming to mind here is MailChimp, where MailChimp, the founders, they were running an agency, and then they started MailChimp on the side. And I think it was for 7 years they ran both companies. And eventually they said, we're going to start MailChimp, but they didn't go for the IBMs, the Intels, the Ciscos of the world. They focused on this group of small businesses, and they ended up building a really profitable company by focusing on this niche.
Yeah, totally. And Basecamp is another kind of very similar story, right? Where they started out writing and building for kind of, as a freelance kind of design agency. And then Basecamp kind of spun out of that because none of the tools that they used felt built for, for folks like them. And they had this blog. And then when they had the product, Basecamp, it was such a easy kind of sell, right? Where they could just, they already had the audience, the newsletter, they now had a product to sell to them. So I think it's like hugely valuable. I think ultimately, like, if you want to build a product, the first thing is like, who are you building for, right? Like that's kind of step one. If you're writing a book, who are you writing for? Who's your audience? If you have a podcast, who's going to listen? When I lived in Hollywood, that's like the first question they always ask you of any project is like, what's your demo? What's the demo, right? Is it, and in Hollywood, it's incredibly specific, right? It might be like 4 to 8 girls, right? Like it has to be very, very, very refined. And I think writing is like a great kind of like low cost, way of learning like who are those people, like who are your people, who are the people who you want to build for, right? And yeah, it's like you don't have to invest in building a product. You don't have to learn to code. You can just write your thoughts about a certain subject matter, get your opinions out there, and then you'll learn like, okay, these are the kinds of people who are attracted to people like me. And if generally, I think if you share kind of like similar opinions with somebody, my guess is you'll also share like similar, views on what products to use, right? Like I think Apple is probably like a sort of the quintessential example of this, where you can just kind of listen to Steve Jobs talk and be like, I think I want an iPhone or a MacBook, right? And now it's kind of a foregone conclusion. I think the whole world wants those products. But I think I started my Apple career with an iBook G4 in sort of pre-Intel, very old school, and even then it was like obvious to me, like, yes, this is kind of my person. And the example I remember was this sleep icon, where when you close your laptop, it would have like the little pulsing white light, right? And every other laptop, it was kind of like almost like an alarm going off, like very much. And with Steve Jobs, he had this bit where he was like, well, your laptop's asleep, so it should breathe like someone who's asleep. And it was like a very obvious thing to me, right? But even that simple thing was like, okay, this person, the kinds of things that this person is going to end up building are aligning with like kind of the way that I think about software and products, which is like I want things that feel human, right? Like human interface guidelines, and now obviously like everyone I think kind of sees that, and but it, yeah, I think it's a great indicator of like, okay, yes, I'm probably going to be. I mean, I notice this even as an investor sometimes, where I'll like someone will pitch me their startup, and even just the name of their company, I'm like, yes, like you're thinking about things the way that I would. Either it's like a pun that I think is funny, or it's like really short and simple, like Stripe. I care a lot about kind of like poetry and like how much meaning you can stuff into a single word, right? And so if I can find a company like Stripe where there's like so much built into that word, it sort of, I can almost guess that these people are incredibly thoughtful about all these other things that are also going to matter to me. And so yeah, it's I think writing is kind of is sort of fundamental in so many different ways as an entrepreneur. Like it shows up again and again and again.
I want to follow that word thoughtful as it pertains to writing. One of the things that I think a lot about for young writers is, do you write every day and publish all the time? If you're a young builder, are you publishing, shipping product all the time, hacking on this thing, hacking on that thing, posting on Product Hunt, posting on Hacker News, seeing what works? Or are you a little bit more deliberate? Your most successful posts have been things that have been reviewed by hundreds of people. They've been written over months and months. How do you think about this idea of being prolific in the early days versus being a little bit more careful and intentional and letting things take time?
Yeah, totally. I think in the beginning you kind of want to lean towards quantity instead of quality, right? The kind of the famous example being like the pottery class where
Ceramics.
the ceramics, right, where the batch that just focuses on quantity ends up with better quality than the group focused purely on quality. And so I think that's kind of really, really, really true. If your metric is just I need to produce, then you're going to produce because you're not so concerned about the uncertainty of is this going to be any good or not, right? It's not like how fast can you run. It's like, did you go for a run, or did you go for a walk? Did you leave your house, right? Like make it as simple to kind of check that box every day. I think that's really, really important. And I think over time, as you build up that confidence, then you can start to sort of pull back a little bit and say, I'm only going to hit publish when I feel like this thing is really, really, really good, because I think you have a relationship with your readers. They kind of trust that everything you put out there is worth their time and energy. And a lot of the stuff you write won't get to that level. Like I produce tons of stuff that I never hit publish on because I just don't think it's good enough. And, in the beginning I might have hit publish on those ideas, partly because maybe that was the best possible stuff that I could produce. But I think over time, you don't really need to do that anymore. I still get feedback on a lot of it. Like I'll write a whole essay. Like I've written an essay on NFTs that I've never published, and I've sent it to people. They've given me feedback. Like it's still not there, right? Like I've written an essay on raising money that never got there, right? And so many things don't. But I do think I still get feedback on all of it. I still think it's incredibly important for me to constantly develop my skill. I think it's kind of this paradox of great creators, I think, are solitary creatures in which they kind of do a lot of their work kind of by themselves, right? J.K. Rowling didn't write Harry Potter as part of a big writing group of people. But I do think getting to that your pinnacle, it requires other people to kind of point out your blind spots and say, hey, this thing you've written is amazing, but I didn't understand this part because you didn't explain what venture capital was, and so I don't get this, right? And so I do think it always is helpful to get people to kind of help you. I think your pinnacle will always be you, but your weak spots can be improved by a lot of other people. And I think it's that where when I read other people's writing, I find that that's where they can improve the most on, actually, is they have an amazing point, but then they spend 3 paragraphs getting to that point. And I'm like, man, if you just had someone review this before, you could have gotten rid of half of this, and it would have been so much stronger. It's actually just deleting stuff. That's the hard part, right? You've already made the point worth making, I think. So, yeah.
Talk about your ABCD framework for editing.
Yeah, ABCD stands for awesome, boring, confusing, and didn't believe. So anytime I ask someone for feedback, especially someone who doesn't give feedback on writing as part of their job or hobby or something like that, I think it's a really helpful heuristic. I start with awesome because I think it's kind of important to kind of start with all the good stuff. It's hard to hear feedback on your writing often, so always good to start with well, what's great about it, because everyone's writing has good parts to it. And then boring, just basically what can I get rid of? What's not interesting to you? What didn't add any value to the essay or the thought or the point that I was trying to make? Confusing, basically, yeah, what, can I clarify something? So not necessarily remove it, but update it. And then didn't believe is, to me, the most important one, which is I want to make sure that every, at the end of the day, I think a sort of the way that I think about making a point is I have to convince you on a few different logic jumps, right? It might be reflecting on my failure to build $1 billion company. The final point is, if I had to pick one, it's basically, you shouldn't, like, $1 billion company is not necessarily a good goal. And it's not a good barometer for success, because there are lots of successful companies that are not $1 billion companies, and there are a lot of $1 billion companies that maybe you wouldn't consider successful. But to make that point, I have to kind of like also convince you on, for example, like why, one, I have to convince you that the industry does care about $1 billion outcomes, right? Like, otherwise, like, it's not a failure to build $1 billion company, right? And so there are some of these logical leaps I have to make, and so I'm always like really harping on that with folks. Like, tell me what you don't believe here. Like, what can I steel man to make this point really, really, really strong, so that everyone who reads this, is kind of undeniable. The point that I'm making. So.
Earlier, you mentioned poetry and valuing the poetry, the elegance. And here you're talking about a pursuit of clarity so that there's no friction in the reader's experience from point A to point B to point C. Even if they disagree with you, there isn't a kind of friction, a kind of confusion in that journey. But when a lot of people hear poetry and when they think of good writing, they think of what we normally learn in English class, of big words, crazy sentences, loquacious prose. And so what is it that you're getting? How are you seeing the writing process differently from such superfluous ways of thinking about this craft?
Yeah, loquacious is a great.
I actually don't even know what that means. I might have used the word wrong. It was just a pretty word. Let's see.
Is a very
loquacious. That's actually only 3 syllables. That's not very good.
But maybe it's a good Scrabble word. I think you're allowed a couple of those, right? Like, I think of it almost like a flourish on a website, or like a hook on an essay, which is like, listen to me because I am smart and I do have something interesting to say. But I find that, like, often that stuff gets in the way. And one metaphor I heard about this was looking through a window, right? And you have like a stained glass window in which, like, part of the art is the window itself, right? So not just what you're looking at, but actually like the way you're looking at it is warped by sort of the medium. And then there's, kind of a default window, which is just looking through it. And my goal with my writing specifically is to basically get as close to the window as possible. Like, I try not to use hyperbole. I try not to even embed my opinions. When I do, I say I think, which, a lot of people may not like. You're taught in English class, like, you don't need to say I think, right? But then there's purple prose, right, which is like the stained glass window prose, which, if I was writing like a sort of a fantastical story, then I might consider embedding more of those words into it. Like, if you're, Lord of the Rings, for example, is full of these phrases, because it helps you kind of visualize like the gestalt, the milieu of the world. But if I'm writing nonfiction, I'm trying to make a very specific point. I want people to get in my head as much as possible, and maybe it's sort of just a personality thing. Like, I prefer like this sort of simplest, line of attack possible, right? I think Naval said it really well. He said tweeting is kind of like firing an arrow, where you want it to be kind of as aerodynamic as possible, because you want it to reach as many people as possible, right? Which means that you kind of want to use words that everybody already knows, right? You don't want to kind of have to go to a dictionary and look up a word in order to get the point. But if you're writing, an academic paper or something like that, you might have different motivations, right? And so my motivations are more kind of the firing of the arrow versus like trying to sound really, really smart. My goal is to make my readers smart and feel smart, not prove to them that I am smart. They're already reading my words. I don't feel like I have that obligation. But if I can give them like really easy, simple sentences that they can go tweet about or share or internalize and digest and tell somebody else, like, I feel like that's where, where I want to win.
Speaking of the arrow way of thinking about writing, I think you do this the best in a post that you called titled "No Meetings, No Deadlines, No Full-Time Employees." And there's a couple things that really stand out from this. The first is that it's immediately clear that you're saying something bold. The second is that this is really you putting a magnet, a frequency I like a frequency. You're putting a frequency out into the world and you're saying, this is the Gumroad frequency. This is who we're looking for. And crucially, I think this is the most crucial thing. A lot of people are going to say, that's not my kind of company. And that's actually the point. The point is to not offend, but to turn off certain people. And that distinction is important, to turn off certain people so that you attract and bring towards Gumroad the kinds of people who will say, man, that's the kind of work environment that you want. And I think that there's something about the global pool of talent that you're drawing from and the advent of remote work that is increasing the returns to this strategy.
100%. Yeah, I use the word alienate, right? I basically want to alienate as many people as possible because the bottleneck to Gumroad's growth is going to be finding 1, 2, 3 of these amazing, 10x engineers or designers or writers to work at the company. And the beauty of software and leverage and global remote work is you can, there's a lot of people, there are very few positions. And so, yeah, totally. My goal is to basically shine a light and say, hey, look, if you're interested in this kind of work, Gumroad's going to be like the perfect place for you. And if you're not interested in this kind of work, you might still find the essay kind of interesting to, but you're never going to apply for a job here, right? Or the other day I tweeted, you can now get a job at Gumroad without talking to a human. And I'm sure 90%, 95%, 99% of people that saw that tweet were like, I'm never going to work at Gumroad. That's super weird. Like, what does that even mean? But a couple people, and I know because I got a bunch of job applications from that, even though I never linked to it or anything like that. Like, people ended up finding it. For a couple of those folks, like, it is incredibly appealing, right? They don't like meetings. I've had people apply who are, for example, deaf, and when they read about it, I guess they can't hear, but when they read about the way that we work, it's like, wow, I finally found a place that I can literally thrive, right? Not just like perform, but like this is like perfect for me. And that's really like, I think the best companies are full of those kinds of people, right? And I think Zuck actually is the person who like ingrained this in me because I think I was listening to a talk that he gave at startup school where he said the goal of cultural values is to basically alienate as many people as possible. Like if you say move fast and break things, a lot of people are like, I don't want to break things. Like most people are like, I don't want to, what? Like, I don't want to break. I want security. Like, I want to go in. I want stability. And then, Facebook attracted the hacker types, right? The people who are comfortable probably shipping too fast, and that has led to them being, now, $1 trillion incredibly successful. And they're still doing it. I mean, imagine $1 trillion company, even though I know they don't say that they move fast and break things anymore. But like imagine $1 trillion company and like rebranding their name. I mean, that's like a big deal, right? Most people, even if you disagree with Facebook on all these sorts of political issues, like that requires a lot that most people are not capable of, right? And they're living up to that value in my opinion.
So what does that loop look like in terms of how do you think about coming up with an idea, working out company values, and then using writing to solidify these values so that you're alienating most people? What does this process look like for you?
Yeah, so normally I just I call my first drafts vomit drafts. So normally I just sit down and I just start like basically trying to throw all of my ideas out there in terms of like what I'm interested in, what I'm not interested in, like certain phrases that I find myself repeating to people when I talk about the Gumroad culture. Like, for example, I started using the word superlinearities a lot with people. I don't know why that word kind of stuck in my brain, but basically this idea that you want to get better and better at something over time, right? I don't want to hire someone and then every day they just kind of do their 9-to-5 job. Like, I want them to constantly be thinking about how to kind of increase their leverage and scale kind of within the company. Another line that we used to use at Gumroad, then we stopped using it because we thought it was too alienating, and now we reintroduced it, is everyone should be a CEO, right? That's incredibly unappealing to many people. Like, no, they work at a company, so they don't have to be a CEO. They don't want to think about the balance sheet, the P&L, all the burn rate of the company, these sorts of existential questions that a CEO has to deal with all the time. But I really wanted to hire people who worked at Gumroad because they wanted to learn these skills so that one day they could start their own their own businesses. So basically, I make a list of all of these things, and then I send it to everyone in the company, and I say, like, disagree with me on these, A, B, C, D, like, tell me what's awesome, tell me what's boring, tell me what's confusing, tell me what you don't believe. Like, am I lying here? Like, do I want this to be true, but it's actually not true? And then it's just literally just like addressing all their comments, like reading through it, saying, okay, how can I address these? One, do I believe that they should be addressed? But most of the time, the questions are worth answering in some capacity, right? Like it might be cleaning up a single phrase or something like that. And then just continuously doing that with larger and larger kind of concentric circles of people, right? Where I might start with like just 2 or 3 people within the company who I really trust, who I think are like kind of the best writers. And then I might go like one, to everybody in the company, and then I might share it with like some of our creators. Sometimes I'll tweet about it and say, hey, I'm thinking about writing this thing. Like, does anyone, want to read this and give me feedback? Just DM me, and then I'll DM it to like 50 or 100 people. I'll kind of spin out different Google Docs for each person, and then they'll give me feedback. And I'll just kind of do that over and over and over again until there's basically like no feedback left, where like the document it's kind of like I've climbed a mountain. Like, I'm not saying it's the best possible thing, but at least in terms of, kind of starting from the bottom and getting to somewhere, like I can't go anymore. And then I hit publish, and I kind of move on to the next thing.
There's a paper I like about the Industrial Revolution, and it's talking about why writing led to a lot of the growth that happened. And the standard trope here is you have the Gutenberg printing press, you have Martin Luther, and all of a sudden certain ideas, they could spread at a much lower marginal cost. And of course, that's true. But this paper builds on something more specific and more precise that I always come back to, which is that take a supply chain. What writing allows you to do is point to a particular piece of information and contend with that piece of information, that specific thing, without dealing with the entire global system. So you could look at a supply chain and you could say, hey, how does this supply chain work? It's actually within the 4th phase, the 7th step on conveyor belt number 3. And what these 3 people do in terms of our afternoon shift, the way that aligns up with this other thing that happens, it's that kind of specificity that actually is what allows us to improve as a society through writing. And I think that as it pertains to business writing, what it allows you to do is, rather than saying, hey, what do you think of the idea? It really allows somebody who's critiquing to say, hey, the overall idea works really well, but it is this way that you're thinking about growth, this way that you're thinking about customer segmentation. And one of our 4 cohorts, cohort number 3, is actually your assumptions here are off. And I think that kind of specificity is what creates the returns to a writing first culture.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great way of putting it. I think, I often think about if you could turn these things into mathematical equations, there's certain variables that affect the output, and then there are many variables that don't, right? Like the color of the sky has nothing to do with the temperature, but, you might think it does. And so it's really important to like break something down into all of the different variables, and then you can kind of tweak them and say, hey, if I remove this sentence, does it actually affect the point that I'm making? And if it doesn't, then I should get rid of it, right? Like basically, if it's not contributing to making the point stronger, I should get rid of it. And I think about painting kind of the same way, which is like, is every stroke contributing to the point of the painting? And if not, I should get rid of the stroke. I should try to, in the industry, it's called brush economy, right? Which is like, how much can I say with how little? And I'm always looking for those moments. I think supply chain is a great metaphor. Like Ryan Peterson from Flexport had that amazing thread about the supply chain issues at the LA ports. And one thing he said that I thought was so awesome, and learning, this is a great kind of meta example of this, where he like highlighted the exact point within the supply chain issue, or framework of thinking about it like this, which is basically every supply chain does have a bottleneck, and you want your bottleneck to actually be the most expensive thing, because inherently if it's not, then like the most expensive thing is being bottlenecked by something else that's less expensive, right? Like that field. But I never had thought about it like that with that level of clarity, where it's like, oh, of course, yes, like make sure that the bottleneck of any system is the most expensive thing. Like at Gumroad, the bottleneck is engineers who are the most expensive. And so therefore I'm kind of doing that right. And I think it's kind of probably the same with an essay, right? Where you have this kind of almost like supply chain, and everyone's getting stuck on a certain issue, a certain point, and that's slowing the whole rest of the system down. And maybe that's fine, right? Like there is always going to be one of those things. And that's fine if that's where you want your bottleneck to be, if that's where you want the mental energy to go into. Like reflecting on my failure to build $1 billion company, like there's a lot of work that $1 billion company plays, and why is that so key? The unicorns and venture capital returns, like there's a lot that revolves around this very specific idea of this binary $1 billion outcome. But it was worth basically putting all of that friction that did exist in the article. I kind of wanted it to be like centered at that idea, right? And I think it ended up working out.
You have a headline in the book that I really liked, which is "Make fans, not headlines." Why is that a smart strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, when I first started writing the book, I noticed that a lot of people would go from building to marketing, and they would kind of skip the kind of making fans portion, the community, the sales portion of the process that I felt was so key, that real feedback loop that we've kind of been talking about for so long. And I think so many people, either when they're writing or they're launching a new product, like they think about it like, what's the news headline? What's the PR thing? I think that's kind of the traditional way that things would have launched out to the world, pre social media, pre Web 2 and Web 3. Like you would rely on newspapers effectively and journalists to tell your story, right? If Justin Bieber wanted to tell his story to somebody, he would have to kind of sit down with a publicist and a journalist and like do an interview, right? And then they would take it and put it out there. And now you have sort of direct to fan, direct to consumer. Everyone has a Twitter account, YouTube account, Instagram account. And in that world, I think it's far more efficient to just focus on making fans and also just not worry too much about making customers of your fans. I think the beauty of the world is and the internet is that you can actually just make as many fans as possible, and then the fans that want, they see your product and they kind of opt into your product, can choose to make themselves customers, right? Instead of this world in which you're kind of blasting out as like basically like an ad, like a billboard, like, hey, I have this new product. I just find that just doesn't work. I think when I see Gumroad's growth, it comes from people who kind of like enter the community. They follow me or Daniel Vassallo or one of our employees on Twitter or one of our creators, and over months they kind of say, oh, I kind of like what these people are about. Like I like what their shtick, right? And then I think that's just part of the funnel. I think everyone has this, but I think a lot of people don't realize it. And so yeah, that's why I think making fans is kind of like the in between step of like strangers to customers, right? Like what's that half step? And I think that is people who are kind of fans. And I wanted to use fans specifically instead of followers or something like that, because there's just, I think that number is just like incredibly inflated, right? Like it's not that hard to have thousands of followers these days, right? But like truly, how many people will support you when you have a book out? Like that's a subset of that follower count, right? And so I think fans is just like a really healthy way to think about it, because ultimately that's what you need, right? Like when you have a new product, you have a newsletter, you have a membership, you have a course, it's not going to be your followers who are consuming that content. It's going to be your fans, the people who really affiliate with you specifically. You're in their top 5 or something like that, right? These people it's not like everyone subscribes to like a million newsletters, right? They generally pick 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And so you want to kind of be one of those for those people. And you have to also understand, kind of going back to the culture point, that you're not for everybody, right? Like I have a lot of followers, but my guess is like a lot of people just follow me to kind of stay up to date on venture or angel investing or the creator economy. And probably a subset of those people are like, I really am a fan of Sahil's and I like what he has to say about these specific topics, right? In a way that maybe like if I threw an event, they might show up, right? And that's very different from like, oh, I like his tweets.
I think there's another cut on the exact same sort of aphorism, which is what's so good about an aphorism is you can just take different pieces from it. And it's that headlines, when I think of headlines, I think of controversy. And when I think of fans, I think of, to use your words, I think of education, entertainment, and inspiration. And what I'm hearing from that is a really fast way to grow and to get a lot of followers is to buzz up a lot of controversy, talk about what everybody's talking about with some kind of perspective that's going to be really unpopular. put out opinions where it's going to be 50-50. A bunch of people hate you and a bunch of people like you, but the people who hate you, they despise you, they loathe you, they say F this person. Whereas to make fans is different. What we were talking about earlier with alienating people is not, this person disgusts me. It's much more, you know what, that's not for me. I'm going to live my life in a different way. And making fans is really about a culture of generosity, a culture of sharing, and entertainment, education, and inspiration as a way to build your audience. And I think that that's slower in the short term, but ultimately more sustainable, because when I think about the people who are the dearest to me, they're the musicians who've stirred my soul. They're the teachers who have ignited something in the world, who made me say, wow, this is fascinating. And it's the authors who showed me a new way of looking at the world, and they tattooed a concept in my mind and gave me a new filter to look at the world with. And now something that I used to gloss over now is something that I can see in technicolor detail, and it just feels like an advantage. It feels like a way of being. And once something gets subsumed into your identity like that, I think that's when you really have a follower that becomes a fan.
Yeah, no, I think that's another good take on it, which is, basically don't lean into the kind of the obvious thing that a lot of people do on social media, which is like basically get into politics, right?
Totally.
It may not politics like capital P, but basically figure out what's the controversy that you can lean into. Instead, focus on, okay, who are you talking to? How can you help them? How can you teach them? How can you inspire them? As a way of building these deep relationships with people. I tweeted when I announced the book, I said, DM me for the first chapter and the introduction. And I got, thousands of DMs, and a bunch of them were like, why would you do this? Like, how do you have the time to do this when you have so many followers? And my answer was like, actually, like, the reason I have so many followers is because I do stuff like this. Like, the way that I built this, this group of people that likes what I have to say is because I spent time with them. It's not because I just went viral and I have pithy things and thoughts. It's because I genuinely have an ongoing discourse with many of these people, privately, publicly, etc. And it's just very hard to kind of really truly build like a large audience that's going to convert into these, into book sales or whatever may be important to me, without doing that. Like, I think it's not really possible. And I think people, when they see these people like go viral every day because they're tweeting about Bitcoin or the federal government or this or that, like, I think they assume that, they're going to convert at the same rate, and it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. I think that this book resonates with me at a really deep level because it's how I built my company. What happened was I was sitting on my couch November of 2018, and I said, next year I want to teach 1,000 people to write online who would be interested. And I asked people to direct message me, and I'd never gotten such a flood of responses. And I was just sort of overwhelmed with how many people responded. I had maybe 10,000 followers at the time, and on Twitter. And I said, whoa, there's something here. And so what I did was, rather than saying, I'm going to build this giant company, I'm going to raise a bunch of money, I just sort of went step by step. And I said, okay, my idea that I intuitively feel is that writing on the internet is extremely underrated. There's nobody who's teaching this. There's nobody who's an evangelist for this idea. And I just started sharing. And over time, by sharing through this combination of sales and marketing, to use your terminology, and actually shipping product and selling stuff, I then ended up building this loop of put ideas out, get fans, get feedback, improve ideas, get fans, get feedback, and I sort of get these virtuous cycles. And what I see is that I was using writing as a way to test my business hypothesis, which you talk about early in the book. I was shipping early and I was shipping often. And actually, I was doing something that I think has come very intuitively to you, which is thinking of writing and business building more like software engineering. And it's sort of like a lean startup, but I think that the fundamental difference is that you're working in public, and it's not quite as lean because you're still starting with a vision. And this is what I like about your advice to solve your own problem and do it well, you give the example of Nick Kokonis, who was working as a restaurant, or he was working as a restaurateur in Chicago, and he was frustrated that people were canceling reservations. And he said, to hell with this, I'm going to start Talk. And he started a new booking platform. And so I think that when you combine all of these things, you get this idea of the minimalist entrepreneur, and you see how writing online and sharing your ideas to an audience at scale, you can, by using the internet, target these precise problems that if you were to go out to Main Street in whatever city you live in, you'd be 20 out of 20 with people saying, I'm not really interested in that. But all of a sudden on the internet, you're dealing with a small percentage of a giant absolute number, which is still a giant absolute number. And because of that, you're attracting those people and solving problems not only for yourself, but for them.
Yeah, Nick Kokonis is a phenomenal example because he also did this exact thing with writing, where he wrote this amazing blog post about Alinea's ticketing problem, he called it, where basically they would have this issue where they would book they would get 100% reservations on every night, and then only 80% of the people would show up, right? And this is a nuance that I learned, is people would show up, but they would show up with 3 people instead of 4. And what do? You can't turn them away, but all of a sudden you're 75% of your revenue that you expected, right? Which is not sustainable for a restaurant like the one that he was running. And so they basically built this thing, kind of like a prototype of Talk, which is basically a pre-order system. They're like, no, eating here is like going to a basketball game. Like, you pay for the ticket, and then you sit down and you enjoy your experience, and then you leave, and you don't have to pay because you've already paid. And everyone in the restaurant industry was like, there's no way that this is not sustainable. Like, this is just not the way that diners will ever, expect to kind of want to do this. And so we wrote this amazing blog post, like super long, gave away all the revenue numbers at Alinea, like one of the best restaurants in the world, like went super deep into how they priced, they would have dynamic pricing, like Uber, where it's like Saturday night is probably more expensive than like Thursday at 5, right? And he wrote this amazing blog post, and my guess is he got, an email from every single person who ended up becoming one of his first 100 customers, right? Because all of a sudden, like, every restaurateur was like, most of them were probably like, this guy's insane. The industry, it would be cool if it worked like this, but that's never going to happen. But my guess is he got a bunch of super forward-thinking people, probably not locals, probably people all over the world, to say, no, this is exactly the way that I want to run my restaurant. This is exactly what I want to do. I want to know that 100 people are coming on Saturday, so I can make a super custom experience for them. And now Talk is an incredibly successful company. And so, yeah, it's Nick is, that is such a perfect kind of story, and he's an amazing writer as well. And I don't think it's a coincidence. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that, like, the co-owner of, like, the best restaurant in the world, Alinea in Chicago, is also, like, just a phenomenal writer, and is literally, like, they have a cookbook, right? What is a cookbook? It's literally written. Imagine, like, the best restaurant in the world gives away every single recipe for free, right? You can go make it at home. And one more story about this, which I think is great, is someone took that recipe book, went through every single recipe, found a bug in the book, was like, I can't make this properly. Like, I'm following the recipe, it's not working the way you said it's going to work. I've tried it so many different times, different temperatures, and then sent Nick an email, and then he invited him to Alinea, the kitchen, him and Grant, and they realized, it was a bug. And I think that guy ended up was a photographer, kind of a fine art photographer, and ended up helping them shoot the Aviary cocktail.
It's a great book,
which is a phenomenal book. That is the best person in the world to help you, take photos of cocktails. But how would you, a job posting would have never gotten in front of that person, right? And so you just have to, there's almost like a level of faith to this way of working, I think, where you just have to put kind of these ideas out there and then hope that, the right kind of people will find them. And I found that they do. I found that people like you and me are constantly reading, like, we're constantly trying to find people who are like us, and there are frankly not enough out there. Like, many people say, oh, is it too late? There's too many people. Everyone has a Twitter account. Everyone has an audience. And I'm like, no, there's still so much blue ocean out there to kind of like make your mark on on a new topic or a new vertical, or just a new idea, right, that hasn't been explored before.
Yeah, to your point on writing, I spent a morning with Nick Kokonis in Chicago, and one of the things that I remember most vividly from our time together was I asked him, what do you do when you're going to launch a new restaurant? And he said the very first thing that we do is we sit down and we write out exactly what we want the experience to be. We write out what people are going to feel when they walk in the door, what the ambiance is going to be like, the pacing of the food, the noise levels, how easy or difficult is it going to be to have a conversation. If it's a little louder, it's going to be a little bit more of a party place, a little quieter. You're going to have some more serious dinners, some deeper conversation. It might be harder to sort of step in as a waiter and insert yourself. Then you're going to need certain things with the spacing. You're going to need certain things with the lighting that actually enhance or counteract other effects in the restaurant. And he said that he starts with that brief, and then he begins to build the restaurant, think about the food, think about the architecture, but it all starts with the written word.
Wow. Yeah. And like, it's one of those things where like hearing that from you, it's like obvious when you eat at one of these restaurants, like it's so like, it is an experience that's been thought through from like the beginning all the way to the end. But when you're in it, like it's kind of paradoxical. Like the more structured it is in that way, like the more freedom there is to kind of move around within that framework, and like the less apparent it is, like, because you're so focused on just enjoying yourself and being present in the moment. You're not thinking about, it's like when you watch an amazing movie, right? You're not thinking about, oh, that was a perfect like plot twist and they did this, and like they structured this foreshadowing over here to or there was a red herring or whatever. No, like the best, when you do it perfectly well, you're actually not paying attention to all of that stuff. You're just so busy focused on kind of the action, and only afterwards do you kind of like look back and you're like, oh my gosh, like that was. And so I often find writers are like, oh, I don't want to do the tropey thing. I don't want to do the structure because it's gonna be obvious, but it's just not. I think readers are not paying attention, at that level that you think they may be.
That's a great point. Yeah, final question. So in Write a Passage, we have three pillars. Writing from abundance, which is, writing from a bunch of material rather than starting with the blank white page. We have writing in public, which is write in public, actually share your ideas with others rather than just journaling for yourself. And then we have writing from conversation, which is a way that you fuel writing from abundance. And writing from conversation is the one I want to focus on here, because one of the things that I think that you do and that you've spoken about here is you said, when I find myself repeating something a lot, I'll write that down. And you're working out ideas in conversation with coworkers, with customers, with friends, other investors. Talk about what that process looks like of having conversations through the spoken word and then bringing those ideas to the page through the written word.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely think the best way for me to start with a new idea, a new thread that I want to explore, is to just start having conversations with people about it. Like NFTs, for example, I really wanted to figure this thing out, not to necessarily write something about it, but I just felt like I can't stop thinking about this idea. It was like food poisoning to me, and I needed to just get it out of my system and kind of like basically give somebody else the problem, so it wasn't me just thinking about it. And so I just started having these conversations over and over again with different people, and I'd say, hey, what about this? This angle, what do you think about the way I'm thinking about this thing? And yeah, just would try to kind of detect patterns, kind of like, like make fans, not headlines. Finding like, what are the key elements of what I'm trying to say here? Like, what are the kind of the section headers of this piece? And generally the way that I write now that I know kind of my style almost, and my kind of my writing fingerprint, I know that I kind of write these like 2,000 to 4,000 word essays, and they're probably broken up into like 5 to 6 kind of sections. And so I'm trying to find like, well, what are those sections going to be, right? Like for example, like what are NFTs measuring in value? Like they're going up in value, it seems, right? But what are we actually trying to measure here? Like when you're measuring like the stock price, it's kind of discounted cash flow, it's future dividends. Like you can kind of, there's like a lot of science in and sort of academia around what a valuation of a company is supposed to represent, right? And this is a totally new asset, so I'm like, okay, what are those section headers? And then once I know that, kind of going to your point about writing from abundance, once I know those section headers, then I try to kind of say, okay, what is everything that I've tweeted about related to this thing? Like I'll kind of search my old tweets. What have I said in conversations? I'll ask people like, hey, I'll go back to those same people and say, hey, these are the section headers I'm thinking about. Like what do you remember that we talked about that you think could fit into this? And then those are almost kind of like the outline. And then I kind of go through and I kind of turn it into a narrative. And at that point, that's kind of when we go into that process of just like pinging those concentric circles of people and trying to refine and refine. And really just kind of, when you write from abundance, like the nice thing about it is then the editing process, it's not easy, but it's simple in the sense that like basically all I'm trying to do is getting rid of stuff.
Totally.
Like getting rid of the boring stuff, trying to make the confusing stuff less confusing, resolving any didn't believes, and then just refining and refining and refining, deleting until, normally I find that my first drafts are like 6,000 or 7,000 words of everything. And then they end up being published at like, 2,000, 3,000 words. So like half the length, kind of like I don't want to answer every single question about the topic. I want there to be, I can go on podcasts, I can do all sorts of other stuff to explore this to the, the people who may care deeply about that topic. But I want the essay to just be kind of that arrow, right? Like that really powerful beacon that's like, this is a really comprehensive, but like kind of the amuse-bouche at a restaurant, right? The thing that wants you wanting more, right? Versus like being totally fully satiated.
Totally. Yeah, a couple comments that come to mind as I heard that. The first is I was looking into the history of Yeezus, the album, and Kanye brought in the producer Rick Rubin. And basically what Rick Rubin does is his whole thing is just pure minimalism, removing stuff, taking things out. And Kanye says he's not a producer, he's a reducer. And that is the thing that works really well for him. And actually a very meta point, kind of leads into my second one, is what's really beneficial about writing from conversation is that if you begin to pay attention, you can begin to see the phrases and the ways of explaining things that really resonate with people. And if you can use the same turn of phrase with, say, 3 people in a row and it clicks for people, now you have your headline or a title or section header, whatever it is. And by writing from conversation, you're actually testing out your ideas to say, okay, what is the best shape of how I can communicate this?
That's awesome. Yeah, Rick Rubin is, that's such a good example of minimalism applied, which is like you're just getting rid of stuff until there's almost it feels like it's like naked, but like I think that maybe that's why people are so scared of doing it, is because it's just your idea that's left, and if your idea is not good, then it's kind of like the emperor has no clothes, and many ideas are not that good, right? So it takes a level of like skill and confidence and craft to be able to say, look, I'm going to get rid of all of the extra, and so you can just see it for what it is, and if the idea is great, then then awesome, but otherwise it's good. People are going to know that it's not that interesting.
Thank you, Sahil. Congratulations on the book, man.
Thank you so much. It was really fun doing this.